Titled Towards a More Impact-Oriented Institutional Monitoring and Evaluation System.
Yeah, that's cool.
Common challenges and potential solutions from a UN perspective. Before giving the floor to Oscar, maybe I should say that now a sort of different type of event starts, because so far we've discussed about the agenda. So what's the agenda? What is it that we need to do for research? What needs to change for practice? And now we're going to give the floor to the institutions who commission evaluations, and let them say, let them have their view on how feasible the agenda is and what conditions need to be in place in order to implement the agenda that we've been talking about the last 2 days. And so the two events that are planned in this sort of mini event is Jos and Oscar presentation, and then the final sessions that will follow after a short coffee break. So thanks again. You can start. I think you don't need that.
Okay, so this one is sufficient. Okay. Thank you very much, Barbara. The title was already mentioned. Before we start the presentation, a few qualifying remarks. First of all, Oscar, he is here for moral support to the presentation, but he will join in the Q&A session. Very, very kind of him. A few qualifying remarks. The presentation is not about impact evaluations, but the presentation will be about M&E systems, and it's worthwhile to briefly define M&E systems. For the purposes of this presentation, it should be seen as the collective of monitoring and evaluation practices within an organization or organizational network, except for impact evaluations as such. They are, of course, part of an M&E system, but we're trying to make the contrast between, let's say, conventional monitoring and evaluation and impact evaluations as a separate category of practices. That is important to keep in mind. Second qualifying remark is the subtitle is Common Challenges and Potential Solutions from a UN Perspective. We certainly do not claim any comprehensive solutions or any level of representativeness at this point. We merely want to highlight a number of issues which we think have broader relevance throughout the UN network. That's basically work in progress. And as to the solutions, this is also perhaps not the right concept. I prefer actually to talk about, let's say, incipient movements in the right direction, you could call it, or initiatives which are moving in the right direction. We are talking about ongoing processes and not about some kind of fait accompli. Okay, this as an introduction. So the presentation will cover broadly three themes. The first is we will talk a little bit about characteristics of impact evaluation practices in the UN system. And here we base ourselves on some of the work and data collected within the framework of the United Nations Evaluation Group, and specifically the Task Force on Impact Evaluation. The second point is we will look at some of the challenges and solutions in developing more impact-oriented M&E systems, and in the presentation I hope it becomes clear what we really mean by this. And the underlying thesis is basically that we want to claim to some extent that from the perspective of generating evidence on impact, actually the marginal utility of investing more in M&E systems, improving them and making them more impact-oriented, is higher than just simply doing more impact evaluations. I mean, doing more impact evaluations is a trend that we can see in the agencies to some extent, but actually the approach of strengthening M&E systems and making them more impact-oriented, in our view, has a higher marginal utility in terms of generating the right information to say something about effects. Of course, all kinds of challenges and which are associated with making M&E systems more impact-oriented, as we will explain. And we will talk about some of the generic solutions, some of the generic steps that could be undertaken to move in that direction of more impact-orientedness. And we will end with a few illustrations of such solutions, of such measures, which are purely illustrative. But certainly all of the examples, and there are many more, they are of broader relevance, so they are not agency-specific aspects. Something about impact evaluation in the UN system. There was some work being conducted in the United Nations Evaluation Group in 2009, an informal survey which asked agencies to respond on their practice of impact evaluation. So these are self-reported data by agencies. They are approximations of reality, because if you would look at the data from a different perspective, this would probably generate different, slightly different results. But anyway, it gives an idea of the practice of evaluation. And in that informal survey, 9 out of 27 agencies reported that they were doing impact evaluation. And if you look at what these evaluations are actually about, and what comes across as a striking aspect is that not all of these evaluations are particularly strong on the attribution, on dealing with the attribution issue, which is one of the defining features of impact evaluation. Perhaps it's also useful to keep in mind some of the remarks and some of the observations made by others in this field. For example, Michael Bamberger, he asserted in a publication in 2010 that probably less than 10% of all impact evaluations of official development assistance are based on rigorous impact evaluation designs. What can we learn from this type of observation, which is not based on hard data, but this is kind of an expert opinion? Well, first of all, that probably in impact evaluations there's a quality issue. Not all the impact evaluations are equally rigorous when addressing, for example, impact attribution problem. Another issue which we can learn is, well, Michael Bamberger has a particular interpretation of what rigorous impact evaluation is, and that is not necessarily the same interpretation of what one would want to call rigorous impact evaluation from a UN perspective. That is something we won't go into, but it's simply an observation that we'd like to make. What are the prevalent methodologies used in these impact evaluations? Many of these evaluations are based on non-experimental quantitative approaches, baseline measurements, ex-post measurements, some type of theory of change approach as a basic framework for data collection. And there's also combinations of qualitative methods being used. There are also examples of impact evaluations relying on counterfactual designs, even randomized experiments and quasi-experimental approaches. So this is, let's say, the information from about 3 years ago. A little bit more recent, there was a publication by UNEC on characteristics of UN evaluation functions. I gave a little bit of information on the size and the mandate and the type of evaluations being conducted in the UN system. And the publication immediately sheds light on the enormous diversity in terms of size and type of evaluation function. And that corresponds also to the topic of impact evaluation. It should be very clear that there's a lot of diversity in the UN system in terms of interest in and practice of impact evaluation. There's certainly a number of front runners in the UN system. I would say UNICEF is one of the organizations which has invested in impact evaluation quite heavily, relatively. IFAD, WFP, FAO are other examples. There was an interesting recent impact evaluation of UN Women on the Safe Cities initiative. There are several interesting examples of impact evaluations, things, and there are some agencies who are explicitly taking the lead in that, while others are not doing much about it. So despite this reality of a number of champions, we can still conclude that most agencies really have little funding available for impact evaluation, and there's little demand for doing impact evaluation in practice. My own agency, where I work, UNESCO, is one of the agencies which has, at least at the level of the central evaluation function, not invested yet in impact evaluation practices. Yet in the UNESCO system there are still examples of impact evaluations being conducted. One example is in Brazil of the Criança Esperança program, which is quite an interesting impact evaluation. So finally, since this informal survey in 2009, the impression is that the number of agencies undertaking impact evaluations and the number of impact evaluations conducted by different agencies appears to have increased. But we did not collect any hard data on that yet. So this is a context. Now the interesting question arises: what would be useful pathways of strengthening impact evaluation in the UN system? And here we can find some inspiration in some of the literature on institutionalization, and one can at least define 3 different pathways of institutionalization. The first pathway is the pathway of simply conducting high-profile, rigorous impact evaluations, which then would create an institutional demand. Stakeholders can become convinced of the utility of such practice, and it then becomes kind of institutionalized practice. And there are some examples that this has happened in certain line ministries in certain countries. Another approach is to make rigorous impact evaluation or impact evaluation mandatory for continuation or discontinuation or increase in public funding of particular programs. And the US is a very good example of this. In development cooperation, you have organizations like the Millennium Challenge Corporation, but also in the US in general, in several policy fields, funding is actually subject to mandatory RCTs. There are also some examples in Latin America. The third pathway is different from the other two in the sense that it does not follow the road of doing more impact evaluation or making impact evaluation more mandatory, but actually the pathway of strengthening the monitoring and evaluation systems towards becoming more impact oriented. The idea is that the reason underlying this is many M&E systems are not particularly strong in terms of specifying the causal logic of programs and systematically collecting data to support causal reasoning of interventions relating to processes of change. And doing this would actually create an opportunity space to do much more focused and potentially low-cost impact evaluations. Perhaps it's also interesting to mention in this context that in a recent study by Epstein and Clearman, I also mentioned the reference here, they found that in the context of the US, that in many cases where RCTs were mandatory for funding decisions, no effects were found by the RCTs, and the reason was not related to the nature of the program, but it was related to implementation failures and problems in conceptualizing and designing the programs, which could also have been identified with other evaluation instruments.
So was that a defect in the design of the evaluation or of the program?
The last remark I made is, well, the law said, basically by law, that in order to roll out a program, an RCT has to be conducted which shows the effects of the pilot program. And if there are no effects, then the project is not cannot receive any more funding.
So the defect was that they found no effects.
Well, many of these RCTs didn't find effects, but that was not related to, that did not prove the hypothesis that actually it was a faulty program, but actually no effects came from the fact that there were implementation failures, which you do not need an impact evaluation to find that out. So, in terms of how do you go about strengthening the monitoring and evaluation system? This is a very interesting, potentially challenging question, and there are many challenges in the UN system which relate to impact evaluation and evaluation in general. First of all, there are a number of demand-side constraints, for example, the availability of resources, but also other issues which relate to the politics of evaluation. There's a broad literature on use of evaluation, some interesting publication which shed an interesting analytical point of view on that, but I will not talk about this part of the challenges. I would like to highlight 4 particular challenges which have methodological implications from an M&E perspective. First challenge is the fact that there is a clear evaluability bias in the impact evaluations which are currently being conducted within the UN system. It is much easier to conduct evaluations on interventions which are targeting the beneficiary level, the level of individual citizens, and that is also where you see most of the impact evaluations taking place. And this is in stark contrast to let's say, a major part of the portfolio of the UN, which actually focuses on this institutional change level. Many interventions of the UN are about institutional capacity building, they are about policy advisory work, they are about political dialogue, they are about standard setting instruments. These are all situated at the institutional level and are seldom object of impact evaluation. The third challenge is that many interventions are multi-actor, multi-stranded, multi-site interventions. We're talking about large programs with multiple actors, often implemented in different countries. Complexity has been a topic in this workshop, especially during the sessions yesterday. There were some interesting discussions on that. I personally, and I don't want to elaborate on it too much, but we could have a discussion on it, I think that there's a lot of scope for deconstruction of complex interventions, and certainly from the perspective of an impact evaluation. Although you are in a multi-actor, multi-stranded, multi-site intervention framework, from the perspective of a particular target group, what is often affecting a particular target group is one particular intervention. Of course, there are many confounding factors and there is a lot of complexity involved in that. From an intervention perspective, it can be relatively simple. Could be, frankly. So that's a third challenge. A fourth challenge is that apart from let's say, the well-known challenge of attribution, which is of course a key issue in impact evaluation, and how to deal with that, actually in the UN and in many public organizations, evaluators are confronted with a demand for impact at multiple levels, not just at a single project level, but at a country level, at a portfolio level, at a global level, which brings 2 additional challenges to the table, which is the alignment challenge. To what extent are projects logically aligned to higher level objectives, and also the aggregation challenge. How do you aggregate, synthesize data from lower levels to higher levels and say something about impact at those levels? So there's what Howard White called a kind of AAA challenge. So what would be potential solutions for addressing these challenges? And I'm keeping it very simple here. There are 3 categories of what you could call movements in the right direction. First of all is very straightforward, to improve the causal logic at project and activity level. and use that as a framework for systematic inquiry ex ante, ex interne, ex post. This sounds very familiar, we all know about it, but it's not happening with the sufficient level of quality in many cases. A log frame is not enough to represent causality, to capture causality. You need something more. The second potential solution is to improve the causal framework of how individual projects fit into larger programs. So it's a kind of nested kind of thinking, causal thinking. How would that look like and what would the representations and approaches be? And the third solution, which is a little bit related to the second, is to develop more analytical tools for specifically aggregating and synthesizing evidence from project or activity-related levels to country levels, portfolio levels. So with these three broad categories in mind, I would briefly like to highlight some very simple examples of not, let's say, finished solutions, but some interesting things that are going on. And it's not exhaustive, and there are many more on which we intend to develop in the future. One example is an approach applied by the GEF, the review of outcomes to impact model, actually developed by David, who is in the room. It's an interesting approach which uses, for example, desk study, looking at terminal evaluation reports. It uses a kind of generic theory of change to extract information from project evaluations, and then assesses on the basis of this theory of change to what extent, let's say, outputs, drivers of impact, assumptions, final impacts, to what extent they have been met, what is the evidence available from project evaluations, and then provides a rating. And the interesting aspect from this is that it can be aggregated and provides a good accountability mechanism for saying something about effects. Of course, there are many challenges to it. The data provided in internal evaluations, not just in the GEF, but everywhere, is very uneven often, and the project is not often a very useful unit of analysis. Second example is very similar. It's from the UNDP meta review on evaluations of country programs, where they also did something like a rating exercise of country program evaluations on the basis of a number of criteria, using a 4-point ordinal scale, semantic scale, which leads to very interesting outputs of frequency tables with criteria-specific classifications of projects using this semantic scale as guidance. And an additional useful element was that a kind of QCA approach was used to look at what are explanatory factors for differences in performance. And here we are confronted actually with the same challenges. Rating is done ex post by different people, and actually the people who did the evaluations, gaps in evidence available from the reports with which you can do something, and the unit of analysis is a problem. You're comparing, you're looking at effects at a very aggregate level, a country program, which is not the same as a particular intervention, that also has problems for comparability. The third example is UNESCO's World Heritage Convention, which is an example of a nested intervention logic, and what you see is that UNESCO provides support to the implementation of the convention at different levels, and on all these different levels there are effects. So it's very interesting as a sense-making framework to see how, for example, UNESCO support at the level of the ratification of conventions will have an effect on dialogue between countries, or at the second level how UNESCO support to national governments in terms of reflecting the convention in policy strategies, how that will lead to changes in awareness. At another level, UNESCO supports line ministries or agencies on translating convention issues into concrete projects, which also has potential effects in terms of quality of programs, in terms of capacities. So there are different levels in which UNESCO may intervene in a particular context, and at all these levels there are effects. And at all these levels one can say something about impact. This is a more comprehensive picture of what could be even still a partial intervention logic of a World Heritage Convention. So what can you say with such an approach? If you have this kind of sense-making framework of how activities at different levels, how they lead to different effects, and how they make sense as a whole, then you have a stronger framework for data collection and for supporting any impact narrative which says something about the magnitude of change and also the nature of change, plus also a sense-making framework on what types of support may work better in what conditions. And it also provides, in my view, a good basis for then doing very focused impact evaluations, which may not be that expensive. A comparative case study designed to look in more detail at the nature of effects at these different levels. There are many more examples of changes in M&E systems towards more impact-orientedness. UNEP has done some interesting work in rearranging their work program to fit better, higher-level objectives, which was already a nice first step to support causal claims. Of course, it needs to be followed by having the right data to support claims on effects. There are also examples of synthetic, systematic reviews being carried out in the UN system, which is also a very useful tool for saying something about what works and why for particular types of intervention. Some concluding remarks on this Thales train high velocity speed presentation. Our basic thesis was, and still is, that in order to promote impact evaluation in the UN system, given the current context of limited resources, the nature of the evaluant, and a number of other reasons, there are higher gains to be realized in strengthening the impact-orientedness of M&E systems, rather than just simply doing more impact evaluations. Doing more impact evaluations is a good thing, but it's not the most cost-effective way if you want to structurally change the evidence base in the system. The second important point is that there needs to be a much stronger focus on the institutional change level. We need much better sense-making frameworks. We need much better a hold on what does a causal picture of particular policy institutional level interventions, what does it look like, what effects can be expected in particular contexts, and to have the appropriate data collection mechanisms for that. And we should acknowledge that this is a very important level of change. I mean, the MDG level and the internationally agreed development goals is a very important level of change, but we should be realistic in the sense that we are intervening at the institutional level. There are important changes which can or cannot occur, and it should be an important focus for our work. And the last point, in terms of addressing the aggregation challenge, how do you deal with aggregating evidence from lower to high level evidence? There are a number of approaches that you can follow. I already mentioned the use of reviews, focusing on particular intervention types, the use of multi-layered, to use the phrase of Patricia Rogers, multi-layered intervention logics. And of course, the last point, what is needed is really a more strategic view on M&E. Most UN agencies have elaborate monitoring and evaluation systems, but they are geared towards accountability, and they are not geared towards learning about what works and not. And there are a number of changes needed in these M&E systems about what data is being collected, how to structure that data, record it, and how to report it, process it, which require more strategic kind of discussion. And with these remarks, I thank you for your attention and open to questions.
Okay. Thank you, Jos. Sorry, microphone doesn't seem to be working. Yeah, I think maybe the battery. Yeah. Okay, let's take some questions. Richard Lonkers.
Thank you very much. That was a very interesting presentation, and having worked quite a bit in the UN myself as consultant and staff member, and I'd endorse all you've said. I'd just make one small comment in that the UN's function, normative function, is an extremely valuable one and can really only be carried out by a body such as the UN. And I think better evaluation of its normative function, which I know is happening, would be very, very welcome indeed. I'd say this because donors force the UN into what one of my colleagues once called a slice and dice approach in terms of annual or biannual reporting on how many conventions have been ratified, etc., etc. So you face pressures not to do this long-term impact evaluation approach, and I hope that you can find some way of resisting donor pressures to cut it up into tiny bits.
Thank you. Bernard, and then Aaron was later.
Thank you. I'd like to know, when you say that very few impact evaluations so far have been done, what is the concept of impact evaluation used by UNEG? Is it all four approaches that we've heard about from Maine earlier today, or was it limited to what is called rigorous impact evaluation?
Okay, let's take another question from Aaron and then back to the questions.
Thank you. Very, very interesting presentation, Joss. I found it very timely as well. But a couple of things. Let me just briefly update what's happening in the GF. Building on what David did, we've actually developed now a way to deconstruct project accomplishments and the way to impact and mechanisms that the projects are using. And we're now looking at the patterns that are resulting in what. So we're much beyond ratings at this point and talking about the actual substance things and how things are happening. We've done it for 500 projects so far, and we've established a system of review every year to do it, and we'll continue. So we'll see what happens in the future. But on the other hand, you know, it is true that indeed at this point the sort of like the bang for the buck is more in doing impact evaluations than doing the actual M&E, as you put it in. But at the same time, we're finding that when we're doing impact evaluations on the ground, lack of M&E becomes a huge problem. I mentioned how we have randomly selected about 45 sites. Of those 45 sites, we only had a stress reduction environmental impact information systematic for 26 sites. And that really handicapped the evaluation, what we could say about what GF was contributing to at the level of ultimate impacts. Now, this is not an easy thing to solve. And taking the technocratic position of just passing a council resolution, GF council resolution, requiring projects to do it might not work, because the problem is very, very complicated. And I will not elaborate on it, but the thinking now is, do we have the right outlook as to what monitoring should be for impact? And I'm really questioning that.
Okay, thank you. So let's allow the speakers to answer, and then we'll take more questions. John Grove and Elliot afterwards.
Thank you very much for very pointed and interesting questions. Let me start with the normative function. And indeed, in the heart of UNEC, the United Nations Evaluation Group, we have many normative agencies that have precisely that role. And we have identified that most of the development evaluation thinking comes from the development perspective and not necessarily taking into account the challenges of evaluating normative work. So there is now, in a very UN traditional way, a new task force responsible for trying to adjust or improve the methodologies necessary to address that shortcoming. But indeed, that pressure is kind of being resisted, particularly by agencies such as, I don't know, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees or on human rights and so on. So that's taken into account. Perhaps I could start a bit the discussion on the definition of impact evaluation, and that is really, as you have seen in the first presentation, still a battlefield of this war that we have been referring to yesterday. And there are UNEC members, UN agencies that want to broaden a bit the definition of impact evaluation so that their work can be included into that. I wouldn't say UNEC definition is very close to the DAC definition, but it puts some emphasis also on the capacity development component of UN work. And I think that is not a finished debate, it's still ongoing. But let me just add one remark. We were hosting this type of discussions also in the network of networks on impact evaluation. And I've heard some NONI members calling the NONI as non-impact evaluation network. Right? So just as an illustration that the debate is ongoing.
Okay.
Just two small points. On just on the concept of IE, I just would like to add, no, UNEC does not see impact evaluation as rigorous impact evaluation, just covering a few quantitative methods, very clear. On the challenge of getting right data from the ground and how to make that happen, it's good to have good guidance on what type of data should be collected, and it's good to have resolutions and to have sticks, but eventually that will not be the only thing that helps. Program officers, task managers, they need to realize that there is a use of this information which is also beneficial to themselves, and we have to think about what these uses could be. And sometimes there's a donor demand for good information, sometimes there's not, sometimes there may be demands within the particular operational units where this particular program officer or project officers are working. But we have to think about incentives apart from, and modalities of using the information apart from the simple compliance approach that we currently have.
Okay. Thank you. Let's take the last three questions. So there was John Grove, then Edith Stern, and any final questions? Yes, get the shot. And then we will end the sessions. Okay.
Thanks, Josh and Oscar. That was a good presentation. Just two questions. What would be the kinds of measures that you would be planning for to make this shift away from sort of the accountability function into something more impact-like, but not necessarily from an impact evaluation as your data source? So have you thought about what kinds of measures would be optimal for that going forward and what those look like? And the second question is, you're hypothesizing that in the environment of constrained resources that this shift would actually maybe be cheaper than doing large-scale studies. But how do you kind of model that out in terms of cost? And what factors are you using to look at that? I would actually argue that it may end up being just as expensive depending on the kind of outcome monitoring that you're trying to get done.
Okay, Elliot?
I don't want to let you off the hook, Gus, in terms of this is what UNEC believes. What I heard you say was that you were using the word rigorous impact evaluation in a very particular way. You were still operating within a counterfactual logic, because that's what I think you believe. And I accept that there are a diversity of beliefs in this room. But I want to highlight the fact that there are people in this room who would, for example, as John May was indicated, say that there are 3 or 4 major schools of causal inference theory and philosophy and methodology in the world, and that it is a bit of an excessive claim. I was going to say bloody cheap, but I'm going to say it's a bit of an excessive claim to only associate rigorous with a limited set of methodologies. Although I respect your right to do it, I don't want you to slide in that assumption into the discourse without it at least being highlighted and challenged. The second thing that was slightly less contentious than that remark, but only slightly. I was interested that you associated nested designs, which, as you know, I'm also very keen on, with the issue of aggregation. Because I think one of the strengths of nested designs, one of the logics for nested designs, is to say that there are different causal patterns, different phenomena, and different outcomes at different levels. So what is happening at the project level, what is happening at the regional level, what is happening nationally, what is happening in policy levels may be different from each other. And we may have a separate theory, we may have a separate methodology. One level we might indeed do statistical methods following a regularity theory. At another level we might indeed do a counterfactual-based experiment. At another level we might do comparative cases using QCA and the idea of combined causes. So I just want to, I'm assuming that I agree with you that there are some occasions, this is partly the question of the micro-macro disconnect question, which is that we always find successful projects and failed programs and policies. There are occasions when we really need to look at the aggregation, but there are other occasions when it is quite legitimate, I would have thought, within a nested design to handle it more at separate levels, and I wonder whether that also has been part of your assumptions in the design and the use of nested designs.
Thank you, Elliot. So let's go to Kathy. Shot.
Hi, I just wanted to raise a question that picks up on something that Richard was saying about the normative value. And I was just interested, I've been doing quite a lot of work on value for money, and I imagine as your DFID recipients, you're also under pressure to do a lot of that. And I was just wondering whether the people within your task force that are looking at normative value are actually making any attempt to sort of conceptualise or think about how you think about value for money in a way that's beyond this very sort of cost per beneficiary, cutting up bits that Richard was talking about. And looking, I mean, a lot of it's around the sort of the politics of value of why donors support and whether for the reputation as well as the actual sort of costs and impacts and things. And also, I just wanted to use the opportunity talking about that just to flag, because I've been reminded by my co-organisers that we are having a conference here in a month's time which is looking at the politics of evidence and the impact of the sort of results or pressure to cut up the sort of bits and report to donors that Richard was talking about, and how that sort of impacts on possibilities to do more sort of transformational impact programming. I just want to find it. But my question to you was, are you looking at how to articulate value around the sort of the normative institutions that a lot of people think have value in themselves beyond the sort of tangible, what you can quantify? Is that something a challenge you're facing, and is anybody thinking about it? And if so, can we talk to them?
Thank you. You can reply.
Very interesting questions. I think they all require more reflection. Let me start by the last question. Value for money and normative work. There is a task force on normative work, as Oscar said. Actually, a colleague of mine is working and is having the co-chairing of the task force. Maybe you could talk with people from the task force. If you look at just at the situation of my own agency, which is to some extent a normative agency, we have a number of conventions. I think when you look at what are budgetary priorities, I think there are a number of things we would always keep on funding with our core budget, because they are statutory elements of our mandate, and they are relatively impervious to what donors say about value for money. So we just think this is our mandate and we have a way of doing it. But next to that, I think we have the obligation to look at issues of cost effectiveness, and we constantly have to ask difficult questions about at what levels do we want to intervene with what partners to have the highest level of impact in terms of awareness raising and implementation of particular standard setting instrument. And that role needs to be continuously questioned. Would like to. Okay. Then Elliot's questions. my use of the term rigorous impact evaluation, your interpretation of it is partly correct. Partly I was using this language because I thought it was a term well known to indicate a certain group of approaches with an impact evaluation, so it was just common use of language. Apart from that, I still feel that particular designs and particular approaches are particularly useful for particular types of interventions, and they have a comparative advantage. I believe in a certain principle of comparative advantages, which is completely different than saying that I think rigorous impact evaluation in all contexts for all interventions is about experiments, quasi-experiments, or non-experimental quantitative analysis. It's absolutely not the case. In fact, most of the institutional change level of the impact evaluation work should be based on rigorous qualitative analysis. I hope that clarifies it.
So would you accept the QCA in a rigorous way, and the QCA in a non-rigorous way?
Yes.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there's
principles of the word rigorous.
Yeah, there are principles of rigor which relate to the methodology and relate to the process of inquiry. Yes, and I also accept your point about nested intervention logics, which have a use to improve sense making and reporting on effects at aggregate levels, but also that there is diversity in terms of what type of methodological approaches to use to look at different levels within this intervention logic. I completely agree. In this particular case, I think we are at the stage where we are discussing the causal logic, and we are discussing the data that needs to be collected. What we have not arrived at yet is to have the particular impact evaluation approaches spelled out, which could be helpful in shedding light.
It's 3 o'clock.
Okay. I think the bell, I was saved by the bell. Next question.
It's not about something you were saying. So.
No, I understand. Yeah. Yeah, the question about costs and is it really more, is it not more costly to start improving M&E systems rather than doing more impact evaluations? Well, there is also one very important principle which lies behind this reasoning, which is the principle of scope versus depth. So you can do only, let's say, a limited number of impact evaluations for a limited part of your portfolio, providing rigorous evidence on the effects of particular types of interventions. What you may want to have first is a reasonable degree of confidence about about plausible effects or lack of effects for large parts of your portfolio before you endeavor into more specific confirmations through targeted impact evaluation exercises. So I think, given this trade-off, I think it's also a good way to start, at least at the M&E systems. The first question, I do not recall what it exactly was. Maybe Oscar.
Sure. And also, just an additional point on the M&E systems and the mix necessary then to have appropriate coverage. It also relates to the ways of funding of evaluation activities. M&E systems of the UN agencies are embedded into core funding, and therefore do not need additional resources which would be more easily captured through extra budgetary resources on demand. And the first question, if I understood correctly, it was about optimal measures to strengthen any systems beyond accountability. And I can speak of an approach used by the UNDP Evaluation Office, in which the presentation of country-level evaluations is made not only to the executive board in New York, but mainly at country level and discussed with national governments. And the engagement of national governments in the presentation of conclusions and recommendations, and therefore really as an important input for the preparation of the next country program, has really enhanced the learning side of evaluation beyond accountability. Of course, is an accountability at local level of what the UNDP accomplished in support of the achievement of national goals, but it has also proved a meaningful way to enhance learning. So, but that is possible mainly at national level and not necessarily at a more aggregate level or global level when we conduct thematic evaluations.
Okay, so thank you very much for this very interesting session. Let's have another